Hi guys and welcome to Dapper Getting Started course. My name is Bhrugen and welcome to my channel. If you are new to my channel, make sure to subscribe so that you are notified when I release new videos. Over the last few years, Dapper has become the most popular Micro-ORM framework in the .NET community. There were many competing Micro-ORMs in the .NET community, but Dapper has emerged as a leader among all of those, and that will be the focus in this course. Before taking a deep dive, you should be familiar with ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core basics. Like you should be able to build a simple CRUD application. In this course, we will dive into what is Dapper, and then we will build an application with the use of Entity Framework. Later on, we will replace that with Dapper. So that will give you a brief overview of what Dapper is and how you can use SQL statements to retrieve data using Dapper. Now that will be covered as a part of this free course. If you are interested in the full course, we will dive into more deeper concepts like Dapper contrib library, mappings in Dapper, stored procedures, and much more. So join me in the journey of exploring the most popular Micro-ORM in the .NET community. Let's take a look at a brief overview of what we'll be covering in this course. We will first start with the basics of Dapper. What does Dapper stands for? What is an ORM? And what's the difference between ORM and Micro-ORM? Once we know the basic foundation, we will implement a CRUD website which will create, read, update, and delete an entity with Entity Framework Core and ASP.NET Core. After that, we will replace all of the CRUD operations which were done using Entity Framework Core with Dapper. With Dapper, we will be using SQL statements to execute our queries, so we'll be writing them as well. This is just a brief overview of the free course. In the complete version, we will take a look at stored procs using Dapper, followed by Dapper contrib, which is one of the most used extension methods with Dapper. We will also take a look at relations in Dapper, N+1 problem, Dapper parameters, and much more. So that being said, let's get started with them in the next video. The most important question is, what is Dapper? Dapper is a .NET Micro-ORM. Now you might be wondering, what is a Micro-ORM? ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. In simplest terms, Micro-ORM is responsible for mapping between your database and your .NET objects. Also, depending on the ORM, it might do much more than just mapping. But a Micro-ORM is really focused on doing the job of mapping between your database and your object and doing that job efficiently. There are traditional ORMs like Entity Framework, which is a full-fledged package. And then there are Micro-ORMs like Dapper. That being said, you might be wondering, what is the difference between an ORM and a Micro-ORM? Dapper is built by Stack Overflow, which everyone uses when they face any issue with programming. Let's take a look at the advantages of Micro-ORM. Micro-ORMs will usually perform better as compared to traditional ORM. Focusing on just mapping the database data to its code representation means less time is being spent on doing other things, because of which the performance will be better for Micro-ORM. Setting up a full-blown ORM framework in your project might be too much if your project only has a couple of database tables with some data. For smaller projects like small utilities, writing SQL query in the code probably will be faster as compared to an ORM. That being said, with Entity Framework, they have made it super easy to get started and running. But if you're using some other ORM, then Micro-ORM might be a faster approach. The next advantage is if your application makes heavy use of stored procedures or view, you might find that micro-ORMs leave your code simpler and easier to maintain. The reason is the logic will be contained in the database, so you won't need all the functionality that comes with a full-blown ORM framework. Other advantage is that micro-ORM works with any database. And one of the things that I like most is you write your own SQL query. So as long as you know how to write efficient SQL queries, this will help you as compared to any ORM like Entity Framework. It's always good to know what are the disadvantages of a micro-ORM as well. Writing your own SQL queries can be an advantage or a disadvantage, depends on how efficient you are with the SQL queries. So it falls in both advantages as well as disadvantages. Because Entity Framework or any other ORM writes the query based on the rules they are told, because of which it might be possible that if you do not take attention with your queries, Entity Framework or ORM might write better queries as compared to the user writing their own query. The next one is working with relations and mapping can be a pain with micro-ORM. Micro-ORMs work well with single object, but for loading relationships on your object, you'll have to structure your queries in a special way. That being said, mappings in Dapper have improved drastically and now relations can easily be mapped, but it's not as easy as an ORM. Lastly, I would say that if you need extensive validations, you are better off sticking with the regular ORM. Micro-ORM's main focus is on mapping and performance at the cost of features like validations. With that, you might be wondering the big question, ORM or micro-ORM? And there's not just one answer with this. The perfect answer will be, it depends. Many projects I have worked on have stored procedures that are needed for complex logic. At those places, Entity Framework lacks the support and Dapper is the way to go. If your application is close to a CRUD application with little complex calculations, I would lean more towards Entity Framework. But if that has a complex logic at the database end, then Dapper or a combination of Dapper and Entity Framework would be my choice. In that also, I would lean more towards pure Dapper, but again, it depends on the project and the requirements. If efficiency is your main concern, I will close my eyes and just go with micro-ORM. So with that, we have a brief overview of ORMs and micro-ORMs, along with the advantages and disadvantages. In this video, I want to show you all the tools that we'll be needing for this course. The first tool that we'll install is Visual Studio 2019. You can install the community version and it's absolutely free. Now, since I want to work with .NET 5, which will be released in November of 2020, I have to install the Visual Studio Preview. Visual Studio Preview will let you work with .NET 5. If you want to follow this course with .NET Core 5 or .NET Core 3.1, anyone is fine with me and you'll be able to follow along. But if you want to use .NET Core 5, then you need to install the Visual Studio Preview for 2019. Next tool that we need is SQL Server, and if you go on the page, scroll down, we have the developer version, which is completely free. And then if you are using the preview version of Visual Studio 2019, then you can download the .NET 5. Currently the Preview 6 is released. So you'll be able to use this when you create the project. So make sure you install the appropriate version from here and we'll proceed from there. If you are using Visual Studio 2019 and not the preview version, then you'll have to install the .NET Core 3.1. After November of 2020, with Visual Studio 2019, you will be able to use the .NET 5. So that being said, for this course, I will be using Visual Studio 2019 Preview with the .NET Core 5 preview version and SQL Server. So make sure you have installed all of those, and let's continue from the next video. I want to let you know an important feature about the naming convention that we'll be using in this course. Now, if I name a model, a view, or a controller in a specific way using a specific spelling, I want you to replicate exactly like that. The reason is I will be providing you snippets later on so that we do not waste our time on ASP.NET Core, views, or UI design. So if you are using the same model names, same controller names, then it will be easy. You'll be able to just copy the content that I provide and use them. If you use different names, then you will have to change those in the template and it will take you longer to follow along. So I hope you name them exactly same like I do, and let's continue with the course. The first thing that we have to do is we need to create a project. So we'll open up Visual Studio 2019 and I have the preview version. The reason I have preview version is .NET 5 has not been released yet. So we'll use the preview version of Visual Studio and we'll create an ASP.NET Core web application. We'll give it a project name and the location as you want, and we'll hit the create button. With that, we will have more options to configure. Right here you see we are using the .NET Core and ASP.NET Core 5.0. You can also notice the preview version that I'm currently on. If you want, you can change the authentication here to include individual user's account. But with that, we will get the DB context configured already in the project. I do not want that. I want to start fresh with the DB context. So we'll just select the MVC web application and I will also enable the Razor runtime compilation. This is so that if we make any changes while the application is running inside the views or inside any of the JavaScript, CSS, then we can see those changes rather than restarting the application. So with that, let's create the project. And great, our project has been created. Once it creates the project, we'll have model, views, controllers, startup.cs, app settings, program.cs, and www.root, where we have all the static files. This is pretty common with the MVC application. If you are not familiar with this, or if you have any doubts with the MVC application, I will highly recommend the free course that I have on ASP.NET Core. You can find more details about that on YouTube or on .NETmastery.com. So I assume you are comfortable with the MVC architecture and the .NET Core project. With that, the next thing that we want to work on is adding entity framework in our project. Let's continue with all of those in the future videos. Before we work on Dapper, what I want to do is I want to configure a repository with entity framework. So that way what we'll do is we'll first make a basic CRUD application using entity framework, and then we'll modify to use Dapper so that we'll understand what changes we have to make. With the use of entity framework, it will get easy to create all the models or the database. So we'll be hitting both of the points with entity framework. First thing with entity framework is we need to create models. So let me add two models that we'll be working on in this project. So we'll right click models, add a new class file. In here, the first model that I want is company model. So I'll say company and we'll add that class file. The company class is a public class, so that is one good thing. And I want 6 properties inside our company. So the first one is company ID, and with entity framework, if it ends in ID, then it will be added as a primary key. So we do not have to specify that, but if you want, you can use the key data annotation If you press Ctrl dot here, you can see the data annotation. If you add it, then it manually adds company ID as a primary key. But we don't need it, so we'll remove that and we won't add it. So in our company, we have name of the company, address, city, state, and postal code. This looks good for our company. Now we need to add this or push this to database. So how do we push that? For that, first thing, we have to add a connection string in our project. We'll do that in appsettings.json. Before we work on that, let's open the SQL Server Management Studio. In here, let's connect to a SQL Server. I will be connecting to LocalDB, MS SQL, LocalDB, and will hit Connect with Windows Authentication. I have many databases in here. If I expand the database, I have quite a few databases here. I want to create a new database called as Dapper for our application. So for that, what we have to do is if we go to our appsettings.json, here we need to add a parameter connection strings. In there, we'll have default connection. The default connection, this is a magic string, so make sure you do not have any spelling mistake here. The server name should be exact name that you used when you were connecting to the SQL server. Database name will be the new database that we want to create. Trusted connection is true because we want to use the Windows authentication and not username password. Multiple active result sets is true, and with this our connection string looks good. Again, I'm highlighting that make sure there are no spelling mistakes here. If there are any mistakes, when we push a migration, you will hit into error message. So you have added the connection string. Now in order to add our company to the database, we need to add few of the NuGet packages. Let's do that in the next video. Now we need to configure Entity Framework in our application. So we'll go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Packages for Solution. Now in here, since we are using the preview version, you will have to select the Include Pre-Release. We'll go to the Browse tab here, and we'll search for Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Now when you install Entity Framework Core, we have to install a provider like SQL Server or any other provider that is supported. So rather than installing Entity Framework Core, if we directly install the SQL Server package, which is Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.SQL Server, right here if you scroll down in the dependencies, you see it already installs the Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.Relational, and in there you will have the Entity Framework Core. So let's just install this one package, which is Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. Since we'll be adding migrations, we have to add Entity Framework Core.Tools as well. So we'll search for Entity Framework Core, and here we have Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.Tools. We'll install the preview version. Those are the only packages we'll install right now. Once we need more packages, we'll come back here. So we have our connection string, and next we have to configure our startup class file. Whenever we're working with Entity Framework Core, and if we have to configure anything that needs to be used throughout the application, that needs to be done in Configure Service. In here, we want to add a database connector for Entity Framework Core. For that, we have to add a DB context class in our project. So in the Dapper demo, we will right-click, add a new folder. Let's call this folder as Data. And in there, I'll add a DB context class. So we'll add a class name. I'm gonna name this class as application DB context, and we'll add that class. Then we need to make sure this class implements or inherits from the DB context class, which is inside Microsoft.EntityFramework Core. When you do this, you need to register a constructor. So we'll do CTOR. And within this constructor, we will be passing the DB context options, and we have the class name, which is application DB context. Let's call this as options, and we need to pass this options to the base class, which is dbContext. So on the base, we will be passing that option. This is just basic configuration that is needed for Entity Framework Core. Now when you have to add any table to the database, you can use application dbContext. So right here, when we have to add any model, let's say we have our company model and we want to add that to our database. So for that, right here, we'll do prop and we'll add a property of type dbSet. This will be on the company model. And companies will be the name that we want to give to table in the database. So the actual name in database will be companies. But right now this has not been added. This step is needed to configure that, but with that we need to execute few statements in Entity Framework to push this to database. The last thing that remains is we have to configure our startup class to use everything that we have created. We have our dbContext, which is the application dbContext, but in order to instantiate this dbContext, we have to use the connection string that we have set up. We'll link everything together in startup.cs. So it's time to configure our configure services method in startup.cs. We need to configure our dbContext class. So that will be done on the services object that we have here. We have add dbContext here. So this dbContext will be applied on what is the dbContext class, that is application dbContext. On that we'll be configuring the options. So if we go to the dbContext, we had those options, so we'll configure the options. Now what is the main option that you can think of? The main option for dbContext is connecting it with our SQL Server. So for that we have options dot. Here we have the use SQL Server, which resides in Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. This tells our application that we will be using SQL Server. When we use SQL Server, we have to pass the connection string in here. That we can access using the configuration object. In there we have a method called as getConnectionString, which expects a string name. So what is that string? That will be the name that we have right here for our connection string, which is default connection. Again, I have said that again and I'm saying it one more time. Make sure you have no spelling mistakes here. These names should be exactly the same. Connection strings should be spelled exactly like that, and you should not have any spelling mistake inside the connection string. Right here we will paste the default connection. This name can be different if you want, but I'll stick with this one. With that we'll close this and everything looks good for configuration of our dbContext. So with that we have added a dbContext, which we have told that we'll be using SQL Server, and we passed our connection string. Once you do that, our configuration for the dbContext is complete. Now I said before in application dbContext, when we added this line 17, this is used to add companies to our database. But we do not have a database yet. For that we'll have to add something called as migrations, and let's take a look at that in the next video. All we have to do is we have to add companies to our database. So for that we'll go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager and Package Manager Console. Here we need to run commands to manually execute or add a migration. So let's try the first command, which is add migration, and we have to give this migration a name. So the name I have given is add companies to DB. The reason is in this migration I know what will be added is this company will be added to database. When you hit enter here, this will not actually go ahead and execute it against the database. It will just create a script that will later on be executed. So you can see the script got added inside the migrations folder. We have add companies to DB, And if you take a look at the script here, all it is doing is it is creating a table name as companies, and it has columns that we added inside the company class. So they have name, address, city, state, postal code, and company ID is an identity column because that is a primary key since it ends with ID. So we want this table to be created. How do we create this? We'll go to the package manager console, and in here we have to write the command update database. That will actually push these migrations to the database. So if we switch to SQL Server, right now we do not even have a database called as Dapper. What it will do is it will first create a database if it does not exist, and then it will execute the commands that we want. So let's expand that, and we have a new database called as Dapper. If we go to tables, we should have one table, which is the companies table. We also have _EF migrations history, and this is just to track the migrations that we push to database using our command with entity framework. Now if I wanted, I could have created this companies table and a database directly, but what I want to do is I want to show you first how to do with entity framework, and then the same things like whatever CRUD operations will make using entity framework, I'll show you how those could be done with Dapper and more advanced feature. So with that, our foundation for one table has been created, and in the next video, let's use entity framework to actually perform CRUD operations. So now our table has been created. We want to perform CRUD operations on companies. So we want to create a company, edit company, delete company, and view details. We can do that very easily using entity framework. So let's do that the first thing. In order to do that, if we go to controllers, we add a new controller. We have an option of using MVC controller with entity framework. We'll select this, hit the add button. And in here we can select a model class, which is our company model, and we need a DB context. We have the application DB context, and it extends from the DB context, so we can select that. We want to create controller with views, and we want to use _layout as the partial view. The controller name, we'll call it or keep it as company's controller, and we'll hit the add button. This will take a while because it will have to install few of the NuGet packages for scaffolding design and the views. And once it completes, we'll go to views, to our partial view, to our parent view, which is _layout. We have the privacy tab. Rather than action for privacy, we'll go to the index action of the new controller that we created, which is company's controller. Okay, so the spelling is correct, and we'll call this as company. Let's run our application and see how things look. It has automatically scaffolded everything, and the CRUD operations should work using entity framework. So if we go on company here and we try to create a new company, we'll hit the create. Great, you can see it has been created. We can edit this anytime if we want, view the details, and we can also delete that. So our CRUD operations are working automatically with entity framework. But I want to make one change. What happens right now? Let me walk you through what exactly happened, and then I'll discuss the change. So when we scaffolded that, it automatically added a company's controller, in that it is using application DB context using dependency injection, and it is retrieving in the index all the companies from the database. In details, based on the ID, it retrieves that specific company and displayed in the view. If we go to create get, it does not have to do anything because the text boxes will be empty. In create post, it retrieves all the data that has been entered, and it creates that with entity framework. When you have to add anything with entity framework, if you are not familiar with this, It's basically underscore context.add and you pass the object. Here you can also say underscore context.companies.add to be explicit, but if you don't define this, Entity Framework is really smart and it detects that automatically. Then you have to save the changes to actually push it to the database. In the edit, it will be almost same as create, but in the edit get, we have to retrieve the company from database. So on the DB context, we are using find async to find it by the primary key, which is the ID. Once we get that, we are retrieving that and we are passing to view to display that. Then we take a look at the edit post, we'll retrieve that, and rather than add, we are calling update on our DB context. And then we are saving all the changes. Last thing that we have is delete functionality, in which we retrieve the company that user selects they want to delete. We display those details inside the view, and once user hits the delete button, we retrieve that company again and we remove it using Entity Framework Core. So this is just the basic overview of the CRUD operations that we have. What I want to do is I want to isolate our Entity Framework Core inside a repository so that we can easily switch repositories in future. Let's do that in the next video. Now we have the CRUD operations, and if you take a look at the views, Entity Framework also added all the views inside the companies. So we have index, edit, details, delete, and create view. I won't be going into much details about the designing because that is not the course. In this course, we want to focus on Dapper. So I hope based on the prerequisites you are familiar with .NET Core and MVC architecture. With that, what we want to do is we want to isolate our DB context for Entity Framework in its own repository. So inside the Dapper here, we'll add a new folder. I'll call this as a repository. In there, we want to add the company repository. First, we'll be adding an interface and we'll call this as iCompany repository. We'll make sure this interface is a public interface. Now in here, what methods we want? We want to implement all the CRUD features that we have. So the first one will be a find method in which based on the ID, it will find out the company and retrieve that. So the return type will be company model and the function name will be find. Next that we have is it should return all of the company. So it will return list of company and we'll call this method as getAll. It basically retrieves all the company. Next we have is we want an add functionality. So it will return a company object and we'll call this method add. Here the parameter we'll receive is a company parameter. So we'll receive an object of company, we'll add it to the database and we'll return back the company object, but this time the ID will be populated with the new ID that got created in the database. Next we want the update. That will be exactly similar to add but will perform updation rather than addition. Lastly, I want to implement a remove in which based on the ID of the company, it will remove that from the database. So these 5 can be treated as CRUD methods that we want to implement. How do you implement those? We'll go to our repository again, add a new class file, and we'll add an implementation for the company repository. I'll call this company repository EF for Entity Framework. This class will implement the iCompany repository and will hover on the squiggly lines to implement the interface. Great, we need to implement all of these interfaces. Before anything, if we go to companies controller, you can see we had the application DB context to perform all the operations. So I will copy this and paste it in our company repository EF. We'll change the constructor name and we'll use control dot to include dapperdemo.data. I'll change the context to DB, and then on this DB we can perform all the operations. So the first thing is to add a company. We have to go to _db.companies.add. We will pass the company object. Once you do this, you need to save the changes. So with that, the object will be added, and then we have to return the obj, which is company object. This looks good for addition. Next we have is find the company based on the ID. So for that, in Entity Framework core, we have db.companies.find method, and we just need to pass the ID. Whatever we get, we'll just return back. You can use find, or you also have first or default. First or default we'll see based on the condition here, and the condition will use lambda expression, and we'll say company ID should match this ID. If you find that record, retrieve the first one and return it. If you don't find it, do not throw an error, but rather return a null object. So both of those will work exactly fine. I'll leave that up to you on what you want. Then we have getAll, in which we will return _db.companies. We'll convert that to a list and will return back. Then we have to remove. Now when we have to remove, we need to first retrieve the company object from database. So we'll say _db.companies.first.default. We can use the same condition that we did here to retrieve that object. Once we retrieve that, on our DB, we have companies.remove method, where we need to pass the company object that we want to remove. Once we remove that, we just need to save the changes and we'll return back. We don't have to pass anything here, so we'll just type return. Last method is the update method, which is exactly similar as add. The method name, we have to change that to update. So great, our repository for Entity Framework looks good. Next, what we want to do is in our companies controller, we want to use our repository rather than application DB context directly. Now we have the repository in place. So in companies controller, rather than using application DB context, we can directly use the iCompany repository, and we'll call this as company repo. I'll change it in here for iCompany repository comp repo so that we can get that using dependency injection. In order to get the implementation of iCompany repository, we will have to go to startup.cs and we'll have to add that here. So services dot will add a scoped implementation of the iCompany repository, comma, what will be the exact implementation for this interface. Right now, we want the company repository EF class. So once we have that, we'll get the implementation right here. Then we will update all of the methods to use the repository. So right here, where we have to retrieve all of the objects or retrieve all of the companies, we will say _company repo. In there, we have the getAll method. Then we scroll down in details. We want to retrieve the object based on the ID. We have implemented a method inside our repo, which is the find method, which expects the ID. Now here the ID is a nullable field, so we'll say .getValue or default to make sure if this is null, we do not throw an error here. So this looks good. Next we have the create post. In here, based on the values that we bind here, we want to add that object. So we'll say _comp repo.add, and we have to pass the company object. We'll scroll down for edit. We have the find again. So let's fix that. Comp repo.find id.getValue or default. and we'll go to the post of edit where we have to update. I'll remove this try catch block and I'll just say comp repo dot update, and we want to update the company object. Now in our application right now, I won't be focusing on validations because those things I have covered extensively in ASP.NET Core courses. Our main focus here will be Dapper. So we'll make sure that we cover everything related to Dapper. Our edit looks good. In delete, we just need to remove that. So we'll say underscore comp repo dot remove, and we need to pass the ID. So we'll say ID dot get value or default. We'll also remove the logic here. In delete right now we have get and post, where in get we display all of the details before removing that, but I'll remove that logic. For now what I'll just do is in get, if someone presses delete, let's just remove that. So once we remove, we will return redirect to action. We'll redirect back to the index action. So we'll say name of and index action. We also do not use the company exist. So with this, now we have converted the company's controller to use our repository instead of application DB context. Let's run our application. Everything should still work the same. So let's try to create a company. That works. Let's try to edit. That also works. Details works. And when you hit delete, now you won't see a view. It will directly delete this company. And there we go. So everything is working with Entity Framework. Now we have a repository for Entity Framework, but we want to change or rather use Dapper. How will we proceed for that? First thing that we'll do is we'll have to install the package for Dapper. So in here we'll go to the Browse tab and we will select Dapper. We'll install that to our project, and perfect. The installation got completed. Next, we have to create a new repository that will implement everything using Dapper. We can copy what we have in company repository for EF, paste it here, and we'll change the name to company repository. Let's just keep it as company repository. We'll copy that and we'll change the constructor name. Now our Dapper repository will also implement all of the same method. So it should implement the iCompany repository, but the logic that we have in here will change completely. So I can just remove everything that we have in here and we'll complete all of that. We won't have the application DB context as well, so we'll remove that. When we are using Dapper, we have to create a new SQL connection. In order to create SQL connection, we need the connection string. If you go to the Solution Explorer Startup, here we use the connection string using configuration.getConnectionString. We need this configuration object, which is iConfiguration, in company repository to get or access the connection string inside our app settings. When we get the connection string, we have to assign that to a private IDB connection. So we'll have a private IDB connection here. Let's call this as DB. Now using dependency injection, I want to get the iConfiguration object. I'll call this as configuration. I want to assign this .db in the constructor with a new SQL connection. You can see SQL connection exists inside Microsoft.data.sql client. So we'll add that namespace, and in here we have to pass the connection string. Connection string we can get using the configuration object. On this object we have the get connection string, and we need to pass the name of the section in app settings, which is default connection. So we'll paste that here, and with that we will get a new DB connection right here in the constructor. Once we get the DB object, on that we can call all of the methods using Dapper. So what we have to do is, rather than working on add first, let's work on get all, because that is simple. We have to write SQL queries like we do in SQL Server. So let's work on this in the next video. Now here we need to implement the Dapper repository. We first want to implement the get all. You can write the SQL queries, but I have provided snippets on top of the lecture where you can download that, and in section 3 I have the queries. First query is get all, which is super simple. It is select star from companies. We'll copy this and we'll come back here. We will be using that query inside the get all. How do we use that? First, let's add a variable called as SQL and paste our SQL query in that. Next thing is we need to execute this query, and whatever is returned from this query, which will be a list of company, we need to return it back. So for that, we'll do that in a single line. We'll say return. Here we'll say db dot. We have the query here, which is inside Dapper. As you can see here, it's not completely visible, but that is a method inside Dapper. Here it expects what will be the return type. When we execute a SQL, what type of object will it return? So it will return a list of company. So we'll say it will be a company object. Then we need to write the query in here. Inside the bracket here, we need to pass the query. So we'll just say SQL, and whatever is returned, we have to convert that to a list. Once we do that, you can see error went away and everything is looking good. So with that, we have written the code to actually execute or use Dapper to select all of the companies from the database and retrieve that. But we cannot just test it right now. We need to finish all of the others so that we can resolve the errors here. Let's do that in the next video. In the last video, we completed the implementation for get all for companies. If we switch back to our snippets, we have find here, which retrieves one company based on the ID. So we'll copy this and we'll go to our find method and we'll paste the SQL inside variable SQL. We'll paste that. Here, one thing is different is we need to pass the ID. This parameter, you can call it whatever you want. You can call this as company ID if you want. Once you do that, you have to assign that when you call it. So we'll say return db.query. The return type will be again company here, and we have to execute the SQL. But this time, along with SQL, we have some parameters. So the parameters, we have to create a new object, and inside here we have to define what will be the parameter name. So the name in query is company ID, so we can paste that here, and what is the value that you have to provide? That is ID. You see the error here of convert type from IEnumerable to a single company object. Since this will return a list, but we know our condition will always return one object, on this we can call the dot single, and that will make sure we return only one object. One thing that you could do is, rather than adding a company ID like this, you can also append plus sign and just add the ID directly inside our SQL. This is a terrible approach. Never do something like this. You should always use parameters whenever you have to pass anything to the SQL statement. The reason is when you use plus sign, you are making your application vulnerable to dependency injection attacks. And we never want to compromise security when we build any application. So never use the plus sign and inject the value directly in SQL. Always pass it by using the parameters. So with that, you can see how we can implement the find using Dapper as well. We still won't be able to execute this because we have add and update pending. Next, what we want to work on is adding a new company. If we go back to our query here, you can see we have 2 queries. Let me copy both of these and we'll switch back. We will create a variable SQL is equal to, and within the double quotations, let me paste that. We'll have to make sure we break it into 2 lines. So we'll add a plus sign and perfect. So what actually we are doing here, let's analyze that. We have an insert statement in which we are inserting in name, address, city and postal code with the values. That's pretty basic. And here we are retrieving what was the latest record that was inserted, find out its ID and return it. So that way we'll get what is the ID of the new company object or row that was created in the database. Inside our find, we were passing the company ID. In add, we have to pass name, address, city, state and postal code. So what will be the SQL? For that, we'll get a variable ID is equal to, on DB we have the query, and what will be the return type here. As you see here, I have cached the scope identity as integer, so the return will just be an integer ID of the new company that was created. So int, and then we have our SQL. Next we need the parameters. So we can create new, and then just like we did with find, we can do at name is equal to company.name, comma, we have at address is equal to company.address. We have at city is equal to company.city. Great, so we have added all of those and everything looks good. Since the property name matches the parameter name in this case, we can remove the parameter name and just type company.name, company.address, city, state and postal code. Then the ID that we received will be the ID of the new company that was created. So we can assign company.companyID is equal to the ID and we'll return back the company object. Perfect, so our add method looks good. And again here if you see we are getting the error because here it returns an IEnumerable. So on this we'll call single. Perfect, so our add looks good, find looks good and get all. In company what I can do is I can just return null right now and we can come back and fix this later on. Now if we go to startup, right now we are using the company repository with entity framework. We want to change the implementation to company repository so that we can see our Dapper in action. Let me add few debugging points in all the 3 methods that we implemented and run our project. First time when we go on companies, we do not have any company. So it hits our debugging point. Let's hit continue and it displays the empty record. Let's try to create a new company. I just entered all 1 and hit the create button. We have the control here. Let's hit F10. We'll hit F10 again. The ID. You see the ID is 3. It gets assigned here. If we do continue, it goes to the get all to retrieve all the company and perfect. It displays our new company. Let's go to database to make sure this is valid. The ID is 3 for the new company. And yes, that's exactly the case. So we can see our add in action and it assigns all of the properties, which is name, address, city, state and postal code, and it creates that object. Now rather than adding all of these 5 like this, there is a simple way. Rather than creating a new object and doing all of this, we can directly pass the company object, and Dapper is smart enough to link automatically since the field names are exactly same. So with this, let's give this one more try. I'll remove all the 3 debugging points. And let's go to company. Let's try to create one more. It's all 2. and it's still working. So we saw a simplified way of creating without passing all of the attributes individually. We can just pass an object which contains all the properties. In the next video, let's implement the update. In this video, we want to implement the update method for editing any of the company. If we go back to our snippet, I have provided the SQL query which is update companies, set name, address, city, state, postal code, where company ID is company ID. We'll copy this, we'll come back to our update here, and we'll have the variable SQL, we'll paste it in a double quotation. We'll stop the application here, and you can break this in 2 lines since it gets too long. We have the plus here and it separates out nicely. When we have to do the update, we do not want to retrieve anything. We just want to update it, that's it. So for that, we have db.execute. We were using query because we were retrieving any of the integer or list of company. But with update, we do not want to retrieve anything. We just want to execute the SQL, and we want to pass the company ID with other properties that have to be updated. Everything exists inside the company object, so we can pass that directly. One thing to notice here is if you have ID here, this won't work. It has to be company ID because inside company, the name is company ID, and that's exactly what you should have inside the @ symbol. If you do not have that, or if the names are different, then you'll have to create a manual object like we did in find and we did in create initially. This looks good for update. We just need to return the company back. So in here, we can return back the company like this, but if you want, you can return back the company object, assign it here, and then send it back. I'll just go with the basic approach here. This is one way of doing things. Another approach you can do is with this, you can execute a select statement, which is write this one, and then you can retrieve that company and pass it back. I am going with the simpler approach because I want to show you the db.execute here. We have used db.query quite extensively, but db.execute is used only when you want to execute and you don't care about what is returned. We will be using this in remove as well. So with that in place, let's run our application and see how things look. The update one is also left as void with the return type, so you can go with that route if you prefer that. Let's try to update this. We'll hit save, and great, our update is working. If you click on delete, nothing will happen because that repository has not been implemented yet. Last thing that remains is delete. Before that, if we go on details, it will display all of the details. So that's also working as expected. Let me stop the application and we'll work on remove. If we go back to our snippet, we have the query to delete a company. We'll paste it and we'll have variable SQL. We'll paste that here. Then just like we did with update here, we'll say db.execute and we'll execute the SQL statement. We need to pass the ID. So we can add a new here and we'll just say ID. You can also say @ID is equal to ID here. But since we can see here the names are same, if you click show potential fixes, and we can fix that by using only ID. Let's run our project and see if delete works. Let's go to company and we hit delete. Great, you can see that went away. So with this, all of the CRUD operations are working, but now we are not using Entity Framework Core. We are rather using Dapper to perform all the basic CRUD operations. So with this, the free course comes to an end, but there is plenty more in Dapper to learn. I have the full course available on .NET Mastery. If you click on Buy Now here, it should take you to the link where you will see all the details that we will do in this course. We have already performed the CRUD operations using SQL, but we have more sections which will guide you through advanced things in Dapper. If you scroll down, you will have all of the course content for the other section. So right here we have stored procedures, then we have contrib, and we have sections with the advanced Dapper. So make sure to check out .NET Mastery for more exciting courses. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so that you are always notified about new videos once I release them. I hope to see you again in some other course.